Hello everybody and welcome to GameGate. Today we're having a look at the Cousins War. This is a small game that comes in a very tiny box, which is designed by David Mortimer and published by Surprise Terror Game. In this game, the players take on the roles of the Lancaster and the York houses. This is a two-player game that can be played in 30 minutes. The player reenact the Wars of the Roses, and since the Lancaster and the York were the two royal branches that attempted to gain control of England through influence, battles, and briberies and betrayal, this is properly named the Cousins War. This is a strategy game that has area control elements to it, bluffing and dice rolling. Let's see how it plays, then I'll give you my final opinions on it. So in the Cousins War, the players reenact the Wars of the Roses. These wars were fought between the houses of York, here represented by the white cubes, and the Lancaster, represented by the red cubes, for over 3 decades during the 15th century in England. Each player here represents one of the houses as they fight battles and gain influence to control England. The players may achieve victory in one of 3 ways. At the end of any round, here we have the round track, if any player controls all the 3 regions here in the map, they win. If none of the players managed to do so by the end of round 5, then the player who controls the most regions by round 5 wins. In case of a tie, the player who won the most battles is the winner. A player is set to control the region if he has the most cubes in that region. For example, here in the northern region, the York is currently controlling it. At the beginning of the game, each player receives 6 cards from this deck of cards. The cards are of 2 types. They may be battlefields or events. To set up the game, each player takes 2 cubes from the supply. Here, this pool of cubes here is called the supply, and they form their respective reserves. So we have the red reserve and the white reserve, Lancaster and York. Also in the supply, we put the blue cubes that represent the French 8s and the 3 dice used in this game. Other than that, each player puts 1 cube from the supply into each region. The players then receive 6 cards each. The very first thing that the players need to do each round is to choose a battlefield and then simultaneously reveal it against the battlefield chosen by their opponent. The 2 battlefields are then compared, and the one that takes place earlier in history is the one that is chosen. For example, here the Battle of St. Albans would be the chosen battlefield for the round. The other card is simply discarded. Now the players need to replenish the battlefield as shown here on the card. So the York player, since the card here shows a white cube, may choose to pick a cube from his reserve or from his supply and put it on the battlefield. So let's suppose the York player chooses to pick a cube from the supply and puts it on the battlefield. Each battlefield corresponds to a battle region on the map. So for example, the Battle of St. Albans shows the southern region here, so this battlefield corresponds to this battle region here in the south. After choosing the battlefield, the players will begin playing cards during their action phase. The player whose card has been chosen as a battlefield starts first. So for example, the York player is able to play a card, apply its effect, and then it goes to the red player, who plays a card and applies the effect of the card. So on until each player has played 4 cards. So the cards that each player may have in their hand is either an event or a battlefield. So each time a player plays a card, they may play the card for their primary event or for their command points, shown here on the top right. So if a player wants to play an event, he may choose to either play for the event text here or for the command point. While if a player now plays a battle card, he may only elect to play it for its command point, for example for 1 command point. So let's suppose the York player wants to play the home event card for its primary event instead of using it for the command points. He simply applies the text in the event. Move 1 or 2 cubes from the battlefield to the battle region. So the York player moves 1 cube from here to the battle region. Right after any card has been solved for its primary effect or for any command points the card may provide, we need to check if on the current round track, so for example here, since we are on the first round, we need to check if on the corresponding round number, so in this case 1, we either have a rose corresponding to the opponent or a red square. In case any of the two is true, and in this case we have a red rose corresponding to the Lancaster player, that player may perform the secondary event of the card. So in this case, as we read here, the opponent, or Lancaster, may move up to 2 of their cubes from the battle region to the battlefield. So the Lancaster player may elect to move this cube from the battle region to the battlefield, and that's what he does. Play then goes to the Lancaster player, and let's suppose the Lancaster player wants to play a card by using it for its command points. He may either play a battle card, for example using 1 command point, or for example he may elect to use an event card but ignoring the primary effect and using it for the command points. Let's suppose he wants to play the Ludford Bridge card but using it for the command points. He has 1 command point. Now the player may choose one of 5 actions. The first is to gain troops in the reserve. So by spending as many command points as shown here, he may move as many troops from the supply to his reserve. So this would be an allowed action by using 1 command point. Otherwise, he may choose to add troops to the battlefield. In this case, he will use 1 command point to move 1 troop from its reserve to the battlefield. Otherwise, the player may elect to use the command points to move influence. To move influence, the player simply chooses one of the 3 regions on the board, and then the player may move a number of cubes up to the command points value of the card into the selected region from adjacent regions. So for example, since we have 1 command point here, the red player may elect to move into this region from adjacent regions as many cubes as the command points provided by the card. So in this case, he would move 1 cube here. Other than moving influence on the board, the player may choose to place influence into the board. With this action, a player may attempt to add a number of cubes from their reserve straight into the board. In such case, the command point value of the card determines the number of attempts that player has in doing so. The player may only add 1 cube into each region. In each attempt is carried out as follows. First of all, the player takes a cube from the reserve and moves into the selected region. Then he needs to roll a die. If the result is greater than the number of cubes he has on the region, then it's a success. And since it's a success, now the player may elect to add the other cube on a different region, since only 1 cube per region may be added each round. Obviously, in this case, the player may not elect to do so, since he has already spent the single command point provided by the card. In case the player had rolled a number equal to the number of cubes present on the region, then it would not be a success but a failure, and the cube would have returned onto the player's reserve. In case the player rolled less than the number of cubes he has on the region, the cube would have gone onto the supply, again because the player failed in adding influence to the board. The last action that can be performed by using the command points provided by the card is to remove an opponent's influence on the board. A player simply needs to name a region on the board, so for example the southern region, and then he'll have to roll again a die. In case the result is less than the number of his opponent's cube on the region, then the roll is a success, and that cube is removed from the board and placed onto the pair supply. If the player rolls a number that is equal to the number of cubes on that region, it's again a success, but the player is moved onto his opponent's reserve. In case the player rolls more, it is a failure and the cubes are not returned. Anyway, once a cube has been removed from the battle, any remaining command points are lost and the player may not attempt anymore to remove any other influence on the current round. So let's suppose the Lancaster player managed to play that card and to remove one influence from the board onto his opponent's supply. Let's now see some of the effects provided by the event card when played by the players as action. So for example, Protector of the Realm. If you control fewer regions than your opponent, add none or one cube to each region from your reserve. So here for example the Lancaster player may elect to move none or one cube to each region from the reserve since he controlled less region than his opponent. As a secondary effect, the York may move up to 2 of their cubes from the battle region to the battlefield. So for example, the York player may move a cube from here, from the battle region to the battlefield. Then we have Joining Forces. Move up to 2 of your cubes from the board to your reserve. So for example, again, the Lancaster player may move 2 cubes from the board to his reserve. And as a secondary effect, the opponent may move up to 2 of their cubes from the board to the battlefield. So for example, the York may move a cube or 2 from the board to the battlefield. Warwick the Kingmaker. Add none or one cube to each region from your reserve. So again, if played by the Lancaster, he may move 1 or 0 cube from the reserve to each region, like so. Here the opponent York may take 1 cube from the battle region or from the battlefield and return it to the supply. So for example, here the York may pick a cube from the battle region, the battlefield and return it to the supply. The Earl of Northumberland. Add 1 or 2 cubes to the north region from your reserve. For example, the York player may move 2 cubes from here to the north region. The opponent Lancaster may add 1 cube to any single region from their reserve. Now the reserve is empty, so they may not elect to do so. As a reminder, the secondary event is always available to the opponent only if we are on the current turn as shown on the turn track here at the top of the card. If it is a red square, then the opponent may always elect to perform the secondary event. Otherwise, he may do so only if it's shown the icon and the rows corresponding to his house. Now let's skip a few turns and move on to the battle phase. Each player played their 4 cards by playing it alternatively, and they managed to move some cubes from their supply to their reserve and then moving them to the battlefield. And currently the Lancaster has 2 cubes of his own and 2 cubes from the French aids that are used exactly as normal cubes belonging to the Lancaster, with the exception that anytime a Lancaster needs to remove a cube, he first has to remove the French aid cubes. While the York managed to accumulate 3 cubes here on the battlefield. Remember that each player will now have 1 card left in their hand, and we'll see what they may use this for. Now, starting with the player that has the most influence in the battle region corresponding to the battlefield, so the southern region, that player will begin by rolling 3 dice. So it is the Lancaster player who begins rolling the dice. He will roll the dice secretly without showing his opponent. Here he does 3 sixes, which is not very fitting for the example I wanted to tell you. But anyways, by rolling this secretly, the attacker, let's refer to the first player rolling the dice as the attacker, may state anything he wants. So for example, he may say, okay, I rolled 3 sixes, and this is almost unbelievable at the very first battle of the game. Now the opponent, without seeing the roll, may choose to either believe the statement or challenge the statement. If he believes the statement, the roll is not exposed and it goes to the other player that will need to beat that roll without actually seeing if the statement was true or not. But if the statement is challenged, so let's suppose the York player challenges that statement because he doesn't believe that the Lancaster player rolled 3 sixes, then this roll is exposed to the other player. If it were true, as in this case, then the York player will need to remove a cube right away from the battlefield by losing it. But if it were false, then the Lancaster player would have had to remove a cube from the battlefield, starting from the blue cubes, as we said earlier. After challenging or accepting the roll of the Lancaster, it is now the turn of the York to roll the dice and attempt to beat either what the Lancaster player declared or the actual roll if it was challenged and exposed. So it really doesn't matter if the statement were true or false. So if the Lancaster lost 1 cube or the York lost 1 cube, anyway the York player must beat the Lancaster roll. So let's suppose the York player rolls the dice and he goes with 2 sixes and a 3. So this actually was a good roll, but it's not sufficient to beat the 3 sixes of the Lancaster player. So anytime a triplet beats a double, then the player who loses will need to remove 2 cubes. If that player rolled a single high number, such as this, then he would have lost all the 3 cubes. If the triplet beats another triplet, so suppose the York player rolled 3 fives, then the York player would have lost just a single cube. So in this case, since the York player rolled 2 sixes, he needs to lose 2 cubes from the battlefield. Then since nobody wiped out his opponent from the battlefield, the battle moves on, and now the attacker is the York player that rolls his dice secretly again and may again state anything he wants. So for example, the York player now decides to state that he rolled 2 fives instead of the 2 fours he actually rolled, again secretly, and the Lancaster player decides to challenge the declaration of the York player. So the roll is exposed. And now let's have a look at what the players may do with the 2 cards that each hold in their hand. Anytime a roll is exposed, either because challenged or because it's the defender's roll that is always exposed to the opponent, then a player may elect to use his last card, and he may elect to use that card by having a look at how many common points that provides and then being able to edit his roll. That player may move a single die +1 or -1 for each common point provided by the card. So for example, having 3 common points, the player may elect to modify 3 dice by +1 or -1 each. So since the declaration was challenged and now the roll is exposed, the York player has the option to use his last card to edit what he rolled. So let's have a look at what he may do. He has 3 common points, so he may elect to edit all the 3 dice. If the card he had left in hand had only a single command point, then he would be able to edit a single die. But the York player was intelligent to keep a very good card in his hand now. So now with these 3 command points, he may edit the dice so to match his declaration. So a 4 may become a 5, and another 4 may become another 5. So the declaration was challenged, and even though the York player lied, he was able to make his roll match what he declared. So actually the Lancaster needs to lose 1 cube from the battlefield. Remember to remove the French ace cube first of all. Now the York has lost his last card and may not do the same trick again in this battle. Now the dice go to the Lancaster player, who needs to roll and attempt to beat that double 5. So here the Lancaster player rolled 2 2s and a 3. Here they are. Let's remember that the Lancaster still has his card in his hand, so he decides to use the card and modify. He may modify up to 3 dice again, since this provides 3 command points, but he just modifies a single die so to make a triplet. This triple 2 beats the double 5 rolled by the York player, so the York player needs to lose 2 of his cubes from the battlefield. And now the York player is completely wiped out from the battlefield. Now any remaining blue cubes are removed from the battlefield, and the York player may move those cubes either into the battle region corresponding to the battlefield, onto an adjacent region next to the current battle region, or back to his reserve. So he needs to decide one of the 3, and the Lancaster player decides to move the cubes onto the current battle region. Let's have a look. If the battle were not won by the Lancaster, but by the York, let's suppose the York had won the battle, the York simply needed to move these 2 cubes onto the corresponding battle region to win the game, since he already controlled 2 regions here, and now managed to control the last region that would have made him win the game on round 2. So, the Cousins War plays relatively quick, but despite his very short playing time, it's got a good amount of strategy to it. You need to be careful to how you move the influence around the board and how you move influence from the supply to the reserve and then onto the board or onto the battlefield. And need to be careful of how your opponent moves his influence around, because in a very few actions, if not in a very few turns, you may see that your opponent has got a lot of influence on all the 3 regions, and if you lose that battle, you'll find yourself losing a game right after a turn or 2. Other than that, you have to be very careful in choosing which card to play and at which time. Not only some cards are situational, but some of the most powerful cards also provide a good amount of command points that you can spend during the battle. So if you have already played that card, you won't be able to use those many, sometimes 3 command points to modify your role during the battle. You also need to be careful in not providing your opponent an advantage by playing a specific card on a specific turn that may allow your opponent to execute the secondary event. Furthermore, there is a very fun experience in bluffing when you roll your dice and you are uncertain yourself if stating the truth or not, and you're trying to go with a poker face and sometimes lie and hope your opponent won't challenge your declaration. Or maybe you have that card left that provides you with a chance to modify your roll, so you go and lie right away, and maybe your opponent challenges you, and then you may spend your card to edit the roll you've done. So there is this bluff and counter bluffing that really adds to the experience and make the whole bluff thing shine actually. So in the end, I admit I love the theme. I enjoyed quite a bit the Wars of the Roses, and the artwork is fitting to the theme and to the depth of the game. This is not a heavy game. I love how the artwork is simple, but it's very fitting to it. So in the end, if you enjoy the Wars of the Roses, the theme, or just a quick game with a friend with a bluff and area control and counter bluff elements, and don't mind too much a bit of luck, because that's actually what we're talking about. We also have a slight amount of luck sometimes, but not that much, then I'm sure you will enjoy the Cousins Wars. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel to keep up with our next episode. Leave a message and I'll reply as soon as possible. I see you soon on GameGate.